Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing? Trust you're enjoying this Our Lady of Guadalupe feast day, and it's a great feast day, a great apparition. Everything worked out so well with that. That apparition took place, and the Protestant Reformation had already begun and was going to cause the loss of many Catholics in Europe. And when we look at the Americas, because Our Lady of Guadalupe is, not just the Lady of Mexico, Our Lady of Mexico, but also of the continent here, the North American continent. So it's pretty cool. But anyway, you see that tens of thousands of Indians that were converted made up for the loss of all those people that were lost to the Reformation in Europe. So it was it's pretty unique and awesome, this apparition. So I just want to point that out. There's many websites, books that you can find out much more about Our Lady of Guadalupe. It's certainly an incredible apparition, and with all the new technology they have in science, you can see that they've looked at the eye and were able to come up with I think it's an electrospectrograph, and they can see the actual bishop in Juan Diego and the people that were in that room when the Toma was revealed with the image of Our Lady. So quite fascinating stuff on Our Lady of Guadalupe, and it's a great devotion. And like I had mentioned just a moment ago, she's Our Lady of the Americas. So prayers today, if you've got some special prayers you want to say, you can do that. And we'll just touch on the apparition here briefly before we go into the crux of the show. The last three episodes that we did were on the spiritual warfare, so we wrapped that up, and I hope you enjoy it. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about the apparition here. So on December 9th, which was just a couple days ago, we celebrate now the St. Juan Diego, and that's the indigenous Mexican Catholic convert who had the encounter with our Blessed Virgin and started the church's devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe. So he was raised according to the Aztec pagan religion, and he was brought up in that culture. And we know that the Aztecs, interesting part about Guadalupe too, is the Aztecs sacrificed people. And that stopped at the apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe. So just a sidebar there. But anyway, he's brought up in that culture. But he showed, now this is Juan Diego, an unusual mystical sense of life even before hearing the gospel from the Franciscan missionaries that came and were bringing the faith to Mexico. Now, I'm going to try and pronounce his name that he was given as a boy. So bear with me if I don't get it. I think you pronounce it Cahotlahatohosan. It means singing angel. And he was born in the Anahuac Valley of what is now present-day Mexico. So he did not get that name Juan Diego. That was his original name. And he and his wife converted and entered the Catholic faith. That was in 1524, because he was born in 1474. So Cahotlahatohosan was changed then to Juan Diego, and he was a farmer. And he was, once he converted to the faith, he and his wife, Juan Diego was very committed. And, we got it made today where we're able to drive and get to Mass, and it's not a problem. But he and the people like him walked long distances to receive their religious instruction. So they were very, very serious about it. And of course, we know that in 1531, he would be the recipient of a world-changing miracle. So, let's go back to December 9th in that year, because Juan Diego was hurrying to Mass to celebrate the feast of, at that time, the Immaculate Conception. But the woman that he was going to the church to celebrate, our Blessed Virgin, came to him instead. And in the native Aztec dialect, the beautiful, radiant woman announced herself as the ever-perfect Holy Mary, who has the honor, to be the mother of the true God, Jesus Christ. So this is how she announced herself. And she told him, I am your compassionate mother, yours, and that of all the people that live together in this land. She continued, and I'm also the mother of all the various lineages of men. So there it is, the mother of mankind. And she asked Juan Diego to make a request of the local bishop. She told Juan, I want very much that they build my sacred little house here, a house that would be dedicated to her son Jesus Christ on the site of a former pagan temple that would show him to all Mexicans and exalt Jesus throughout the world. Now, the Blessed Virgin was asking a great deal of a native farmer because they were simple people. And not surprisingly, his bold request was met with skepticism from the bishop, Juan de Zumagara. So Juan Diego said that he would try to produce proof of the apparition after he finished tending to his uncle, whose death was imminent. So after this meeting with the bishop, he's making his way to church on December 12th, 3 days later, to summon a priest for his uncle, who was again dying. So Juan Diego encountered the Blessed Virgin Mary again, and she promised to cure his uncle and give him a sign to display for the bishop so that he would be convinced that this apparition was real. Now, on the hill where they had first met, she told him he would find roses and other flowers even though it was winter. And doing in faith, as she asked, he found the flowers. And Juan Diego brought them back to the Blessed Virgin. Now, the Virgin Mary then placed the flowers inside the tilma. That's the traditional garment that Juan Diego and the farmers would wear. And she told them not to unwrap the tilma containing the flowers until they had reached the bishop. Now, when he did, Bishop Zumagara had his own encounter with Our Lady of Guadalupe through the image of her that he found miraculously imprinted on the flower-filled tilma. And now Mexico City, the basilica there, houses the tilma and has become, by some estimates, the world's most visited Catholic shrine. Now, the miracle that brought the gospel to millions of Mexicans also served to deepen, certainly, Juan Diego's own spiritual life. For many years after the experience, he lived a solitary life of prayer and work near in a hermitage near the church where the image was first displayed. And pilgrims had already begun flocking to the site by the time St. Juan Diego, died on December 9th, 1548, and that was the anniversary of the first apparition. And then St. John Paul II beatified St. Juan Diego in 1990, and he was canonized in 2002. So we just touched upon the story today, but it's an incredible story. And like I said, with all the scientific advancements they made in these electrospectrographs, they've got so many things now that they've been able to determine that that the image is not paint, but is actually raised off the actual tilma just a little bit. And it's a fascinating story when you get into it. And like I had mentioned before, they discovered in the pupil of the image eyes. So it's a great thing to do. And if you've got some time today, you might want to go on the internet, or if you have any access to the books, and sit down for a few minutes and read about this incredible apparition. And as I mentioned, there were many converts, and that they had replaced those that were lost during the Protestant Reformation over on the other side of the ocean in Europe. So, fascinating story. Couple quick things here. did you, I'm not a big believer in dreams, and, you can take them for what they were. There are some things, obviously, God uses dreams. We know this with St. Joseph, right? Where he was told to take the Blessed Virgin as his wife and not to worry about that she was with child because it was done by the Holy Spirit, and to take Jesus and get him out of harm's way when Herod wanted to kill him. So we know the dreams. We certainly know with Joseph in the Old Testament having the dreams, Daniel. So we've got a rich, rich history of these dreams. So God can definitely use them for spiritual purposes. Now, that being said, many dreams are just something that we can, I'm not an expert on dreams or any type of psychologist or psychiatrist, but, we have what we have. Sometimes they're influenced by events during the day or something that happened previously, what have you. So, and we don't need to put much stock in them. But some they could be from God. So it's certainly something you have to discern. You can talk to your priest or spiritual director about maybe some dreams you've had. But I want to talk about a mystery here in Boston Harbor and point something out while I'm going into this. Before we get into some of the talk of our show, what we're going to begin about a little bit of morality we'll talk about today on today's show. But I want to talk about this interesting story and then make a point. It comes from a gentleman, unnamed, but he said one Sunday morning when he was waking up and rising, his wife told him that she'd had an unusually vivid and strange dream. In it, she said she was in a building and entering an elevator behind a somewhat taller woman who wore Caribbean-like clothes, colorful long dress, and a head wrap with dark skin. And the wife told him that she looked to the woman in the elevator with her like a native Caribbean, something maybe, of the West Indies. Now, they were the only ones, this guy's wife and the lady from the Caribbean, in the elevator. And she walked in first, and the wife followed her. And then the Caribbean lady simply looked at this gentleman's wife and said, 2, please, meaning the second floor. Now, the guy's wife's name is Lisa, and this is what she recounted. The woman didn't do anything, but all of a sudden, the elevator detached from the building and began moving swiftly, very swiftly, over a body of water. I was obviously frightened. It wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, and all of a sudden, the elevator seemed to stop, and I looked down and saw like an island with what looked like 4 dark-skinned natives lying on the ground in a row and covered with big leaves, kind of like big banana leaves, she said, some kind of vegetation. And the only thing you could see was half of their bodies up to their chests. I couldn't tell if they were dead or they were sleeping, and I was confused as to where we were. And I turned to the woman and simply asked, where are we? Now, the woman didn't seem surprised at what the elevator had done, that it had become airborne, and acting as if it were something that was supposed to happen. And the Caribbean woman replied, this is the island of Nix. And that was the end of the dream. Now, Lisa, upon waking, wondered what was the island of Nix. And the husband and Lisa had never heard of any land by that name. But the husband went and did a Google search, as many of us do, and to learn that Nix Island, it was called Nixmate, exists in Boston Harbor. It's a tiny bit of stone that now is used as a navigational beacon. So there was something by that name, and it was surrounded by water. But Massachusetts, and how do you explain the big palm leaves of the natives, the Caribbean garb? So this husband decided to look further into it, and upon further reading, he revealed that found that Nixmate was once 12 acres in size, and the island was used as a pasture and a place for the ships at that time to load ballast. Now, here's the interesting part. Pirates were hanged at Nixmate, and their bodies displayed there for a while to deter other buccaneers. Now, that was a common thing. If they did this in Europe too, William Wallace, the character in the famous movie that Mel Gibson made, Braveheart, that's what they did to him also, because they would hang and put these people up as an example not to go against the powerful, the secular society, or this would happen. I mean, we look at what the Romans did. That was one of the reasons they crucified people, and many of them, as a warning, don't mess with the Empire of Rome, or this will be your fate. So these bodies were displayed. Now, the story goes that one convicted pirate protested his innocence until the very end. He stated that the island will be washed away someday, and that would be proof of his innocence. And within a century, the high cliffs of Nick's Mate had eroded away, and what you have now is just this rocky shoal. So, the King's Handbook of Boston Harbor, written by a guy named M.F. Sweetster in 1883, described Nick's Island as a large gravelly shoal between Long Island and Gallops Island, partly bare at low tide, and crowned by a singular and ominous-looking beacon. It is a massive piece of copper-riveted masonry, 40 feet square and 12 feet high, with stairs on one side, upon whose top stands a black wooden pyramid, which was replaced by concrete in World War II, that is 20 feet high. And the federal people now own it, so it's off limits. Now, what about the Caribbean connection? Well, it turns out that the pirates who used the island were often from Jamaica and headed for New Guinea before a mutiny. And after the mutiny, they headed up the eastern coast of America to Boston Harbor. And it was known as Nick's Island as early as 1636, and murderers and burglars were executed on the Boston Common or on Boston Neck. But the people whose crimes were perpetrated on the high seas suffered the penalties of the law in sight of its accusing waters. Now, the most popular legend associated with mate states that Captain Nix was killed at sea and his mate was charged with the crime and executed on the island. Now, another form of the legend says that Nix was a pirate who sailed into Boston in 1680, and his ship had a lot of treasures that he had taken from unarmed ships. Now, when he anchored in the harbor, he and his men went ashore, and on a dark night, and like the old treasure pirate stories we're familiar with, buried several bags of coins. And which, to keep the secret as close as possible, we've seen this in the movies, Nix murdered his companion, thus the name of the mate and the island, and buried him there. So, upwards to a century, Massachusetts Bay was infested with pirates who plundered these vessels, and we see that it was a short, swift, and stern retribution when caught. So, as a result of all this, was it cursed? That's what we're looking to see. Because another famous sufferer on Nick's Mate was William Fly, who headed the crew of the Elizabeth in a mutiny while on a voyage from Jamaica to Guinea. And he threw the captain and mate overboard. And afterwards, they changed the name of that vessel to Fame's Revenge, and they became pirates on themselves up along the American coast. But their prisoners who they would capture rose up on them, and they placed Fly and 3 of his men in irons, and then they ran the Fame's Revenge into Boston, where the buccaneers were executed. And Fly was hung in irons on Nix's Mate over the grave of his Confederates, and here they say his bones shook and rattled in the sea air for many months as a grim warning to all mariners. So you see this island has a tumultuous and violent history. And we have an alternative to that and of the origin of the name of Nick's Mate. And this was presented by a fellow named Edward Rowe Snow. And he wrote in 1944 in a book, The Romance of Boston Bay, Snow quoted a letter from 1700 He said a vessel was anchored off Mixed Mate, and the passengers could hear strange sounds of the waves striking the cliff on Party Island. And a Dutch passenger called the noise Niksjesmal, which translated into Old Dutch to Old English was the wail of the water spirit. So, the bones of the pirates, long gone, washed away at Nix's Mate, but do their restless spirits remain in the harbor? And that's what we wonder. And the food for thought would be, were islanders that were once taken as slaves and then executed on an island or executed in Jamaica haunting the pirates? Might it be that unsettled souls on the island are in need of prayer, that they languish to this day in purgatory? Now, this guy's wife, guided to the place by an islander, who, though stoic, perhaps found mercy not only for the slain islanders, but for the exploiters of her land. And that's from Michael Brown. So his wife had quite an interesting circumstance. Now, Michael makes out a good point that, and you may find this, and this is the point of me telling you that story, that sometimes when we have these dreams, that they may be an indication that souls in purgatory are crying out for prayers or for masses so they can be released. Now, I'll share a couple personal stories. One is my brother who had passed away. He was a very, very good athlete, and he was getting in shape for a upcoming softball season when he was 40, and he went on a bike ride, and he had a heart attack. And just a week before, he had gotten a clean bill of health checked for the heart, with the stress test and everything. It was heart problems running our family, and he passed away. And I never dreamed about him or anything. That was a very devastating time, and I had no dreams or anything like that. You know, some good memories, things like that we all have. But years later, I had come back to the faith and was serious about my faith, and I had a very vivid dream of him. It was the first time. And he was dressed in white, and he was helping as an altar boy at Mass. And then a couple of days later, I had another dream of him in a church. And, by this time I knew, there may be something here. So I went and got the Gregorian Masses. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but St. Gregory had, I don't remember now if it was a monk or a friend, but there was, he would see him at the altar. And so he knew he was in purgatory, and he decided to do 30 Masses for this individual soul consecutively. And at the end of the 30th Mass, that soul was released and he saw him no more. So that became a tradition of having 30 consecutive Masses, said the Gregorian Masses. And I did that for him. So I had the 30 Masses consecutively said, because I thought, there's something more to this dream. This is a little different than what I'm used to. So that was my discernment, and I'm very glad I got those Masses. Matter of fact, his wife and I chipped in for them because they are expensive. But if that's something that you feel compelled to do, by all means, do it, because they're very powerful. And if you can't do that, I'll give you another example. A friend of mine was having dreams about a friend of his that had passed away, and they were coming frequently. So he ended up getting the Masses for him. So that's something that we may want to consider if we have these dreams about friends that have passed away or loved ones, or even like in Michael Brown's story here, where it's not a relation of theirs, but there seems to be something spiritual, something mysterious about this particular dream that his wife had, that you may want to definitely pray for these people, and even possibly get a Mass, because as you know, that the Mass is the most powerful thing we can do on earth for souls, and very, very important. And the prayers, and when we do the Divine Mercy Chaplets and the offering up our rosaries or our daily devotions. Also, any sacrifices, suffering that we're undergoing, any crosses, to offer that up with the cross of Jesus for souls is very powerful. So that's what I just wanted to pass that story, because I thought it was an interesting story. But the important part is that we try to use our prayers in the masses for the people that were having these dreams, or that we whether they be for our loved ones or just someone that we're not familiar with but having dreams or something like that. So very important to do that, because in your discernment, you may find that these dreams are not just something in your subconscious, something that affected you earlier in the week or that particular day, but are actually a spiritual sign from God, because God does use dreams to give messages. So we want to be aware of that, but we don't want to get sidetracked and put a lot of credence on them, because many people do get wrapped up too much in dreams and start to read every dream is this particular instance happened here, and I need to do that, and I can trust this, and we've got to be very careful with that, because a lot of dreams are just that, plain dreams, and nothing to get too worked up over. So anyway, that's for your discernment. Okay, we'll start the main topic of the show here. I wanted to begin, and that was with Catholic morality. And my opinion these days, in the culture in which we live, it doesn't seem as if there is a great deal at times of morality in our world or honor. And these are things that we really need to kind of come back to. Now, morality, when we look at it in the Catholic sense, okay, what is morality? Well, when we look at morality in the way that we as Catholics look at it, or should look at it, is that we go back to Mark in the scripture where Jesus asked Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" Because that's really, when we're talking about this, a key question. Because that question, when we have to answer that individually now, not as in a communal sense, we'll talk about that later, but individually, we have to be aware that that question has significant ramifications for us, whether we choose to acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God, that he is God, that what he said and taught is the truth, or we can dismiss him completely, or just say, he was a great, he's a good guy and a good humanitarian and a pretty good teacher, but he wasn't God. So those are questions that each individual, when proposed with that question, can answer. Now, we as Catholics, and if you're listening to the show, I'm guessing that you do accept Jesus as God. That's our base of morality, because the Christian morality, our Catholic morality, begins with that, "Who do you say that I am?" And that's because when we answer that question in the affirmative, that Jesus is God, it means for us and the moral life as Catholic Christians, what does it mean then to follow Jesus? And it basically means, as he was, we're going to suffer and we're going to be rejected. Because that's what happened to Jesus himself. I've mentioned before that the Holy Family didn't have it easy here, and that's a great understatement. They struggled. When Mary's yes to the angel Gabriel became the critical moment in mankind's salvation history, that it wasn't going to be a cakewalk for Mary or Joseph or for their son Jesus. So we can expect that same thing because Jesus, again, asks that we follow him to pick up our cross daily. And that isn't easy, especially at any time. At any time. It wasn't easy when Jesus walked the earth because we know what happened to him. He was rejected, not only by the powers at that time in the Roman Empire, but by the people that he loved, that the people that he did all these miracles for, that he walked and taught and healed. They rejected him. And we know what happened to the apostles after that, with the exception of John, that they were martyred. So it's never been easy. And to get Christianity off the ground, they were tremendously persecuted for the first 300 years, tremendously so, until Constantine won a victory. And he won that victory and credited to the sign he saw in the sky going to the battle, and that was the cross. Now, it's interesting that Constantine never converted to Catholicism or Christianity himself, but he did make it the state religion in the Edict of Milan. So Christianity then came out of the shadows into the light and grew and grew and grew. So we see this, that Christianity, following Jesus, has never been easy. It's not going to be, and it certainly isn't now. And the key then for us in morality that asks, once we get the question of who do you say that I am, the next question, if we answer in the affirmative, is that what then do you and I become through our moral actions? Because this is the key, that through the moral choices that we make, the choices that we make in our lives that are influenced by people, by the environment we are brought up in, by society, are critical because they shape us in who we want to become. And who do we want to become? Well, since we're followers of Jesus, we want to become like him. And that's the basis that we need to look at in our moral capacity, because we're trying to become the best people we can be through the grace of Christ by following Jesus and trying to emulate him. And that is where our morality, the third part of this, is that do our lives reflect that? Do our lives reflect Jesus in the society and times in which we live? Because you and I, being human beings, and this is divine revelation. Divine revelation gets us to the point where we are unique as human beings than any other creatures that God created, because we have the capacity to know God, have a relationship with God, and delve into the mystery that is God. Now, other creatures, they don't have that capacity that as creatures of Christ that we have. So that makes us unique. Now, for the animals lover out there, and I'm one of them, I don't mean to shortchange anything in God's creation, because all of God's creatures reflect his beauty, all of them. And they reflect his goodness. And importantly, they reflect God's own personality. Now, that's why it's important, and this is all part of our morality, or it should be, that we are good stewards of this creation. Because when we exploit it for our own needs, This is what Pope Francis wrote about in Laudato Si. We cannot just use God's creation as a stepping stone for something, for our own exploitation, for the wants and needs that we have. We're called to be good stewards, and that's not easy in these days. Not easy at all. But we see that the vastness of God's creatures and creation is just so beautiful, so staggering. And it's, at times when we look at space and we look at the planets and all that is, it's almost incomprehensible. But we do feel elevated in a contemplative way when we look at these things, because it is so awesome. It is so awesome to see that. So this is all part of our moral base. And that is the key, is how we live. Because what makes you and I human? What makes us different than these other parts of God's creation? We look at our experience, right, as human beings, and we see that our experience shapes us, that we can be rational. And what does that mean? Our experience in our lives makes us rational because we understand and we can make sense of the things that we need to, that qualify us as human beings, the things that we know are part of the natural law. And, that natural law is something that God initiated, and it's where we discover through reason and our faith how things fundamentally work in this creation and in our lives. So that's very important, because God is the author of that natural law. Now, needless to say, not just as a society or societies, when we go against this natural law, when we break the natural law, we're going to have some big problems. And we've seen this across the board with the environment many times. And we see this individually in our own lives. When we go against the natural law and we commit sins that are against the natural law, there are consequences. And we as human beings, we as individuals have, these are important to us because they affect us directly. And other people's sin, we've talked about this before on the shows, sin is partly social also, and affects us even though we may not know individuals. So by our being rational, we're able to know this. We're able to know good versus evil. We're able to know sometimes when it's right to do this and sometimes when it's not right to do this. Now, I say sometimes, and I don't want to say 100% of the time, because there are circumstances where we do not know the entire picture as God does. And that's why it's very difficult to have a morality that's just black or white and be very juridical and very judgmental, because we don't know the circumstances. We don't know the people's hearts and why they do the things they do. But God does. That's why it's important for us not to judge. So we need to take that in consideration when we make moral decisions based on, of course, what the church teaching is a well-developed conscience. And we're not supposed to go against that conscience. But it has to be well-developed so we have a good base to work off of. Now, in addition to that we're talking about experience, there's also irrational behavior. And these are the things that don't make sense to us. Things like the genocide of Rwanda, the death camps in Germany and Poland. Things that we just can't understand. So that's part of it too. That's part of the human experience. Some of our behavior, getting angry, making it, thinking and panicking at certain situations in our lives where we make irrational decisions which are not good for us and not good for those we love. But that's all part of the human experience. It's all part of our morality and growing into the people God would like us to become. And that is Catholic Christians that follow God. We try to become, strive to become. And then a third part of that is the non-rational in our human experience. And that's where we talk about the mystical. And you may have had this in your lives with a certain mystical moment or contemplative moment where you try to describe your experience, your supernatural experience to someone, and you basically come up with words can't describe what I felt and what I saw. That's the non-rational. And that's how we experience life in these ways. So that's all part of us in our human persona. And, it's all part of what they call, right, Christian anthropology. This is all part of our development as human beings. Now, a question when Jesus asked Peter, what we begin here our talk on morality, and who do you say that I am? Many people that believe in God and have a faith, and it's a gift of faith, it's open to all, but it's a gift. And we must, since God initiates the conversation, we can either accept or reject that gift of faith. But the reason people don't accept God is one of the critical things is they have to change. If they're living a life that is certainly not in line with what God wants for us as human beings, that's a very difficult thing, especially if they're comfortable, they're successful in their lives, they're happy in their lives, or think they're happy in their lives, that they don't want to change the status quo. We as human beings, for the most part, some do, don't really like a lot of change, especially drastic change. And when you have a conversion, and Christ now is leading you toward him, and it's a constant conversion, day in and day out until our last breath, it's tough. It's tough. Because when we just think we've made some gains, we can easily slip and fall. And that's our nature. I mean, that's what's going to happen. That's why God asks us, he wants us to just keep trying, to persevere. He mentions in Scripture, those who persevere will be saved in the end. So that's important for us to remember, especially when it seems, we're getting down, we're not growing as fast as we want, we keep committing the same sins, having to go to confession, confess the same sins, not being patient, still being angry, all those things, giving into the lustful thought, all of it, love of money. So he wants us to try. And the other part, and this is like my thing, I like to think that I'm in control of things. And, deep down, I know I'm not. Deep down, I know that. We had a couple deaths in the family. My car, all of this in the week. My wife's car was parked out on the street. It got totaled. So all these things you plan and that I plan, we like to think we're in control of this, but really we're not. We're not. Things can change, and they can change quickly, and it's scary. But this is true. The spiritual life is unplanned. And that's hard for us. It's hard for me sometimes because I have a plan. This is what I'd like to do. I laid it all out. And the spiritual life is not like that. I remember, I think either somebody told me or I read it somewhere, where some people used to get upset with Mother Teresa because she would be having a speaking engagement and the Holy Spirit would lead her away from that. And the people, that had planned this, and she would call and cancel, said, no, I'm being led by God to go here and do that. They weren't too thrilled. But that's the spiritual life. So it's not planned, but unplanned. And again, I mention that because this is all part of what we need to grasp as our conscience begins to develop and we start to make these moral choices. Because, our actions, we are responsible for our own actions. And this is very difficult today to accept for many people in the culture. And that's because we're always looking to blame someone. You know, that goes back to the Garden of Eden, right? What did Adam say? Yeah, well, the woman got me to eat the fruit. It was her fault. And already the finger pointing had begun, and it still continues. And we do it. But the bottom line is that you and I are responsible for our own actions. And we have free will that God gave us to use in the choices we make. And that's what makes us responsible. We can't be blaming people. And the part is, when I heard a story about a near-death experience by, I believe it was a nurse, and the gentleman that told me this, that told us that in the class, had mentioned that he knew the woman, and she had a huge brain tumor, like it was the size of a fist. And it was benign, but they still had to take it out. And when she was being operated on, her spirit came out of her body, and she was looking down on her body, and the surgeon's doing the operation. And she said, look at that, and I'm fine. And she had an encounter with Jesus that she said the love was just incredible. Incredible. And her life flashed before her, and everything that she did good and everything she didn't do good were right there in front of her. And she said that she knew that she was responsible totally because the truth was right there in front of her and she couldn't pass the buck. That these were her choices that she made, the good and the bad. And there was no copping out of it. And she was judging herself in this near-death experience, not Jesus, but her, the individual. And she said when she encountered Jesus, and I believe he said that Jesus told her to go back and try to do better. Very simple message, to love more. To love more. That she felt that love was, and she just got a little taste of it, she said, that she would burst. It was overwhelming, the love. Never experienced that like that before. And then she went back in her body. So while I mention that is because right there, it was interesting what she said, because it's what the church is teaching, is that God doesn't judge us. We do the judging ourselves, but we aren't responsible for those actions through our free will and the choices we make. And our actions also have consequences. And you know what? That is, if we really meditate on that is really something that should give us pause, because the ripple effect that we could do, either good or bad, I think we have a hard time, and I know I do, comprehending. Such simple things as holding open a door for a person when they might be having a terrible day, to give them, and even though that little act shows them a little bit of hope and a little bit of kindness, there's somebody out there that actually cares. There are some good folks out there. Has a great ripple effect, because they may turn around and pass what Jesus gives on to another. And yet on the flip side of that is also the ramifications when we do bad. We also don't know how devastating slamming the door in front of somebody, a short word with a clerk. We just don't know. We don't know what kind of day they're having. Very difficult stuff. So that's why we really have to watch what we say, think, and do, because, we are responsible for our fellow man. We are. And Jesus wanted to love him and the way he loves each other. And that's tough, very difficult at times. But again, this is all part of the human experience. Now, we see that when we look at this revelation, I mentioned that divine disclosure is what that is. I'm talking about now the revelation of what it is with us as human beings, not per se what Christ left the apostles and what we know of his birth, life, death, and resurrection, but what we have is unique creatures to understand God in the mystery. And basically, you have two types and in our human experience, and that's the transcendental, where we have a sense that something, this is what Karl Rahner, who's a famous theologian, said, that we are created as spiritual beings, even though we may not acknowledge it. We may be atheists and don't even think a moment about God, but we still are created by him and have that leaning toward spirituality. So we seek that horizon, as Mr. Rahner, seeking horizon, always looking, because that horizon is God, always seeking for something greater than ourselves, looking at that horizon. And we just know that this can't be, this death, this destruction, that we're not designed for this separation when loved ones die, that there's something better. And that's that spark from God. That's the transcendental. And then the next, according to Karl Rahner, is what they call categorical. And these are what, we're used to. It's reason, it's the historical facts, it's the sense of God through Scripture, tradition. And so this is where we, our reason, again, starts to take over, because this is our reality now. And our reality, and I wish this were true of all folks, but that believe this reality. Our reality is Catholic Christians. And the reality, really, whether you believe it or not, is that everything exists in God. Everything. And I'm not going off on the New Age here and, God is the tree, God is the cloud, God is a piece of grass. No. Everything exists in God because God created. He is the creator out of nothing. Not of something that was already there, but out of nothing. So everything exists in God. Therefore, that makes God present in us and everyone. Why? Because we are made in his image. Now, if we could do that and look at our brothers and sisters and really put that into practice, and I don't do it, wow, what a world this would be. But we strive, we try to, but we will fail. And again, God initiates all this conversation, all of it. So, again, the question here for us is, who are we becoming as followers of Jesus and in the decisions that shape us? And the key actually is in Scriptures in Philippians. And what does St. Paul talk about there? That God was equal to God, but he did not grasp at being God. But what did he do? He emptied himself. I believe they call it kenosis. He emptied himself, self-emptying. So God's love then, because is sacrificial. And we see that through the cross. That God's life is sacrifice, dying to self, and isn't that difficult, brothers and sisters? To get rid of the selfishness, to get rid of the me and what I need and all these things. How hard that is for me, how hard it is for most of us. But that's the key. That's what St. Paul's talking about in Philippians, that emptying of self. And that is what we're striving to do. And this can be done in little bits. Not in great leaps, but over a period of time that build up. Because when we get into the discussions, we'll have to continue next week, of our moral choices and what this means for us, is that if we are good in the little things, if we make good choices based on what our conscience, our developed conscience with our faith, tells us is what Jesus would want us to do in little things, especially when we're by our lonesome and not with others, we're going to do those things in the big picture. When it really is critical, there are critical moments with a lot on the line. If we've been doing this morality over a period of time in little increments, we'll do it during the big things. Because, it's easy for me to go into a church and try to be holy around other holy people, and you're with church, and there's the reverence and everything like that. And it's entirely different. And I'm sure you've seen this, right? You get out of Mass, you get out of Eucharist. This has happened to me. You argue with your spouse. Somebody cuts you off in the parking lot. Hey, what are you doing? And it starts bingo right after Mass. That's what we're trying to do differently. That's, as Catholic Christians, that's what we're trying to reflect in a society that pretty much wants to throw God out by the powers that be. We need to reflect Jesus in this. That's that self-emptying. That's the dying to self, and it's not easy. And that's what I mean by when we are alone. When maybe we know that something's wrong, to get us a little bit more money if we doctor this little figure when no one is looking. That's a key moment for us because no one is looking. And that's where we have to make that choice, to do those good things, those right choices based on our Christian principles, because we follow Christ and love God and want to emulate him, rather than the way that the secular world goes and just grasping to see what we can get out of all this. So these things are very important. We look at what the Catholic Church teachings is on 4 things that are points that we try to do in a moral life as Catholic Christians. And we'll try to wrap up the show, and we'll touch on this, Lord willing, next week, is that we look and see that we want to lessen human suffering. That's a big thing. That's a big thing, to try and lessen human suffering. And then we look and we see that what we try to do next is that we want to try to prevent and resolve conflict in all strata. And that's tough, because it's not just on the world scheme, but individually, whether it be our co-workers, our marriages, our family, neighborhood. That's what we want to do. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3 is that all nations, that all groups, that all individuals, and even ourselves, what we are trying to do, as I mentioned this a couple minutes ago, is we try to look at the individual as he is made in the image of God. And what a wonderful world it would be if we could do this. And then what we see is number 4. And that is a life that is built on integrity. And that is, again, difficult to do in our society in those choices that we make. But these things, these 4 points of Catholic morality, they also, and we'll talk about this next week, lead us into an identity of who we are. And that's important, because I mentioned a minute ago about our actions having consequences, the choices we make that develop us into the human beings we want to become for Jesus, and that we have free will in all this. And we see that free will is a wonderful gift, and that God will not encroach upon that any way, shape, or form. That he gives us that free will, even in the consequences, and in many, many cases. We've seen man's inhumanity to man, and we've got to be cautious with that. But we'll touch on this again in our search for this morality, because, again, I think it's an important topic for this time, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of it out there. And that also, when the Catholic Church talks about a life of integrity, that's what honor is. And, especially for my father's generation, honor was a big thing. And I don't think there's a lot of that today. Again, I'm generalizing. There are people that have honor and put that close to their heart to live that out. But there doesn't seem to be a great deal of it in our society today. Anything goes as long as the means, justify that end. And that is no way to live as a society. And that's one of the reasons I believe things are coming apart. So anyway, I hope you have a blessed week, brothers and sisters. We'll try to pick this up, Lord willing, next week. God bless you and your families, and have a great night.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.